Hello, everybody. This is Tchaikovsky. Welcome, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at segment reporting. Before we look at segment reporting, let me give my disclaimer over here. So, the information and opinions in this presentation are those of myself only, and not my employers or affiliated organizations, including but not limited to Irvine Valley College and the South Orange County Community College District. The presentation is for educational purposes only and does not constitute any legal or accounting advice whatsoever. This presentation is copyright 2008 to 2026 by Bennett Tchaikovsky. All rights are reserved. Any distribution is strictly prohibited. Throughout the presentation, I will make reference to publicly available information that is the copyright of other parties. I do not claim any right to those parties. Okay. So for segment reporting, why is this important for investors? Well, there's certain enterprises, say such as like Amazon, which they do retail sales, but they also have Amazon Web Services, which is a huge component of their business. Similarly, companies like Disney, you may have like theme parks, theatrical, within companies. If a segment becomes really large, it becomes very important for an investor for them to kind of understand where that revenue is being generated, which parts of their businesses are profitable versus losing money, how much risk is concentrated in one area, and what happens if a major segment is disrupted. And what becomes a reportable segment? So a reportable segment is a distinct part of a company's business operation that meets certain size thresholds, requiring separate disclosure in the financial statement. So what you're typically going to see is you'll see revenues, and then in the back you'll essentially see kind of like a breakdown by segment. And under GAAP, an operating segment, again, if it has discrete financial information available, has its results regularly reviewed by the chief operating decision maker, and it earns revenues and incurs expenses. Now, when do we go through and report it? So we're going to run essentially three tests first. So a segment becomes reportable if it meets any one of these three tests. The first one is going to be the revenue test. So it's essentially if the segment revenue is 10% of combined revenue for all segments. And what's really important here is we're going to include intersegment revenue. And what I want to do with this is as we're kind of reading this, I want to go through our example because I think that'll be the best kind of way to better understand this question. So let's take a look at our question over here. We have Tech Ventures Corporation, and we have five basically separate departments. So you have software, hardware, cloud services, consulting, and then you have retail. And so the first thing, kind of going back over here to our test here, is we're going to be including intersegment revenue, which would normally be eliminated upon consolidation. But what we're going to be doing is including that here. So the key thing for this first part is we're looking for what is above 10%. So if we take the total revenue, including intersegment revenue, and we basically say, okay, this 150,000 divided by 850. So this is going to be 17%, 11.76%, 58%, 7%, and then 4.71. So again, how did I do this on Google Sheets? Well, if you put a little dollar sign in front of where the F and the 22 is for the denominator, it'll basically copy that same value down. So as of right now, in terms of reportable, so we'll call this the revenue test, and we'll say division A, or we'll say yes, 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 no, and no. And the reason why these are no is because these essentially here fell below the 10% test. Okay, let's take a look at the next test. We're going to run this through. So a profit or loss test. The segment profit or loss is greater than 10% of the combined profits or combined losses. However, what's really important about this particular test is we are going to ignore the losses when we're determining the total profit. However, when we look at losses, we're going to look at them on an absolute value basis. And let's see what that really entails. So for purposes of determining the total profit, we're going to include 18. We're not going to include the loss on the hardware division, but our total profit right here is going to be at 127,000. However, for purposes of determining the profit for the 10% test, we'll call this profit slash loss. What we'll go ahead and do is we're going to basically say, okay, well, we've got 18. We're going to look at any losses on an absolute value basis. We're going to come over here. And now what we're going to go ahead and do is kind of do the same things. We're going to basically take 18,000 and we're going to go ahead and divide that by E. And that is going to be 30. So again, as we're looking at this test over here, okay. So again, it's got to be 10% or greater. Okay, so what we're going to go ahead and do is that, well, for the profit test, the profit loss test, okay, again, it's meeting basically these parts over here. However, these two segments are still failing to go through and to meet that part of the test. So we'll just go ahead and mark this as basically as green. We'll use blue for the next one, but of course I screwed that up. Let's put this over here. Okay. So that is essentially this part here. Now let's take a look at our next test. The segment assets are 10% of the combined assets of all segments. So here, when we go through and look at this, we're just going to go ahead and say, okay, well, the total assets divided by T slash 37. And again, okay. So this one here, this basically the assets, right? This one here fails, right? And we'll go ahead and mark this with blue because these are below 10%. But as we're going to see momentarily, that really doesn't matter because all it has to do is we just have to meet one test. Okay, so here, so again, what are the reportable segments going to be? It's going to be anything that had a yes. So A, B, and C will go through and be our reportable segments according to this, basically to these tests. Now, there is an additional test, however, we also have to go through and employ. And this is something called the 75% rule, which is after applying the three tests, revenue, profit, or loss, and identifiable assets, there is an additional test that basically must be satisfied. The combined revenue of all reportable segments must equal or exceed 75% of the combined sales to unaffiliated customers for the entire company. So what we need to go through and do now is to go here and look at this for our 75% test. So what we're going to do is external revenue, and this is our 75% test. So this is going to be 120,000, 85, 480, 60, and 40. Now, what we're defining as reportable segments are going to be parts A, B, and C. So we're basically saying that these A, B, and C right over here are going to be our reportable segments. And this is the big drama, right? As we look at this right over here, we have to kind of say to ourselves is, okay, does the 120, 85, and 480 meet? Is this effectively 75% of this? And the answer to that is yes. So we have met the 75% test. Now, if by some crazy reason, right, it didn't meet this, what would we go through and do? What we would then do is we would then look at the smaller segments and we would start bringing them in until we got to that 75% threshold. So if this say was 70%, we would then go ahead and look at consulting first because their external revenue is the next largest segment. We would keep on bringing in segments until we got to that 75%. So this is like somewhat of like a smaller topic, but segment reporting is one of these important things to be for us to be going through and looking at in intermediate accounting. Thank you for being with me here today. I look forward to seeing you on future videos. Sorry I didn't have a cat visit on this one today, but you can only control what you can control. And I'll see you on the next video. Thank you for watching. And again, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email to ivc30tocpa@gmail.com. Have a great day.